The bridge of the UHS Defiant was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a ship at rest, but the tense silence of a crew holding their breath. Captain Daniel Cross stood at the center viewport, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the darkness of space that was anything but empty. Out there, invisible to the naked eye but clear on every sensor screen, the Krell Empire's border fleet moved in precise patterns that had kept this region locked down for 300 years. Daniel was 42 years old, though the last 6 months had aged him considerably. His dark hair showed new threads of gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from too many nights spent staring at tactical displays instead of sleeping. He wore the standard Earth Navy uniform, dark blue with silver trim, but the insignia on his collar felt heavier than it should. 4 silver bars that marked him as captain. 4 bars that meant 247 lives depended on the choices he made in the next 72 hours. Behind him, the bridge crew worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Kate Morrison sat at navigation, her fingers dancing across holographic displays as she calculated their next micro jump. She was 28, brilliant, and had the kind of mathematical mind that could plot courses through spaces that should be impossible to navigate. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight regulation braid, and her green eyes never left her screens. At Tactical, Commander Lisa Grant monitored the sensor feeds with the intensity of a hawk watching for prey. She was Daniel's executive officer, a woman of few words and absolute competence. 40 years old, she had served in the Earth Navy for 22 years and had seen more combat than anyone else on the ship. Her brown skin showed a pale scar along her jawline, a souvenir from a boarding action 5 years back. She trusted numbers and strategy more than she trusted hope. The weapons console was manned by Ensign Jake Palmer, barely 23 years old, and on his first deep space assignment. He had graduated top of his class at the academy, but classroom simulations were nothing like the reality of sitting in enemy space with enough firepower around them to vaporize the Defiant 1,000 times over. His hands trembled slightly as he ran system checks for the 4th time in an hour. Down in engineering, Lieutenant Patrick Hayes kept the ship running on what could only be called miracles and stubbornness. He was 35, stocky and strong, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. He had joined the Navy to see the stars, but what he had seen instead was his wife and 2 children murdered when the Krell raided the mining colony where they lived. He had asked for this assignment, begged for it. If there was a chance to hurt the Empire, he would take it. The Defiant was a destroyer, one of Earth's newer ships but still outmatched by Krell technology in almost every way. She was 300 meters long, armed with missile tubes and particle beam weapons that would be considered formidable in human space, but were barely adequate against Krell shields. What made the Defiant special was not her weapons but her crew, and the desperate mission they had volunteered for. In a secured compartment deep in the ship's core sat a data storage unit the size of a shoebox. It contained evidence that would change the war, proof that the Krell Empire had been testing biological weapons on human colonies. 20,000 people on New Horizon were dying from a plague that the Krell claimed was natural. The data core proved otherwise. But proof only mattered if it reached the Galactic Council, and the Council was on the other side of Krell space. Daniel turned from the viewport. His crew looked at him, waiting. They had been running silent for 36 hours, threading through gaps in Krell patrol routes that Kate calculated down to the second. So far, they had not been detected. So far, they had been lucky. Kate spoke quietly. Her voice was steady despite the tension in her shoulders. She reported the next jump window would open in 4 minutes. 3 Krell destroyers would pass through their current position 17 seconds after they left. The margin for error was essentially 0. Lisa looked up from her console. Her expression was neutral, but Daniel had served with her long enough to read the concern in her eyes. She informed him that long-range sensors were picking up increased Krell activity in the sectors ahead. Their detection grid was tightening. Someone suspected something. Daniel acknowledged this with a slight nod. They had known the deeper they penetrated into Krell space, the harder it would become. The first sector had been almost easy. The second sector had required Kate to pull off maneuvers that should not have worked. The third sector, which they were about to enter, would be worse. Jake cleared his throat nervously. He asked if they should run a final weapons check before the jump. Daniel smiled slightly. The kid was trying to prepare for a fight they could not win. If the Krell detected them, weapons would not save them. Only speed and Kate's genius would. Daniel told him weapons free, keep the systems hot. It was better to let Jake feel like he could do something. The minutes ticked down. The bridge lights were dimmed to reduce power signatures, casting everything in a faint blue glow from the instrument panels. Daniel could hear the soft hum of the ship's systems, the quiet breathing of his crew, the almost subliminal vibration of the reactor that Patrick was nursing along 3 decks below. Kate called out the countdown. 30 seconds. 20. 10. The Defiant jumped. Space twisted around them in ways human eyes were not meant to perceive. For 3 seconds they existed in hyperspace, a dimension where distance meant something different. Then they dropped back into normal space, and Kate immediately killed their forward momentum, letting them drift like a piece of debris. Lisa's sensors swept the new position. She reported clear skies, no contacts within immediate range. Daniel allowed himself to exhale. That made 11 successful jumps. They needed at least 20 more to reach neutral space. Then the proximity alarm screamed. Every head on the bridge snapped to tactical. Lisa's hands flew across her console, pulling up the contact. Her face went pale. She reported a Krell-heavy cruiser bearing 27 Mark III, range 800,000 kilometers and closing. They must have deviated from their patrol route. Daniel felt his heart rate spike but kept his voice calm. He asked Kate for options. Kate was already calculating. She reported they could jump again, but the Defiant's drive needed another 8 minutes to recharge. They could run on conventional engines, but a Krell cruiser was faster. They could hide behind the nearby asteroid field, but Krell sensors would penetrate it within 10 minutes. Jake's voice cracked slightly when he spoke. He wanted to know if they should power up weapons. Daniel saw the young man's hands shaking. Lisa answered before Daniel could. Negative. If they powered weapons, their energy signature would spike. The cruiser would detect them immediately. Their only chance was to stay cold and hope the Krell passed by without active scanning. Daniel ordered all systems to minimum power. He told Patrick over the ship's internal comm to reduce the reactor output to bare life support. Then they waited. The Krell cruiser moved across their screens like a hunting beast. It was massive, 3 times the size of the Defiant, bristling with weapons and sensor arrays. Its hull was dark purple, the color of the Empire, and it moved with the confidence of absolute power. On the bridge of that ship, Krell officers would be scanning space, looking for any anomaly, any hint of the human vessel that intelligence reports suggested had penetrated their borders. 700,000 kilometers, 600,000, 500,000. Jake was gripping his console so hard his knuckles had gone white. Kate's eyes were fixed on her navigation plot, calculating escape vectors they might never need. Lisa watched the tactical display with the stillness of someone who had accepted that death might come in the next 60 seconds. Daniel stood at the center of the bridge and projected a calm he did not feel. This was command. His crew needed to see him steady, needed to believe that he had a plan even when there was no plan to have. 400,000 kilometers. Then Lisa's console chimed softly. She looked at the reading, then looked at Daniel. The cruiser was changing course, turning away. It had not detected them. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They watched as the Krell ship's distance increased. 500,000 kilometers, 600,000, 1 million. Only when the cruiser jumped to hyperspace did Daniel allow himself to sit down in the captain's chair. His legs were suddenly weak. Around him, his crew slowly began to breathe normally again. Jake laughed, a slightly hysterical sound quickly suppressed. Kate leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a moment. Lisa resumed her sensor sweep as if nothing had happened, but Daniel noticed her hand was trembling slightly. Patrick's voice came over the comm. He wanted to know if they were clear to bring the reactor back to normal levels. Daniel confirmed. He also told Patrick good work. The engineer had gotten their power signature so low the Krell had missed them at less than 500,000 kilometers. They spent the next 6 hours in that position, making small jumps when Kate identified safe windows, drifting when Krell patrols came too close. It was exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and precise timing. The crew rotated through shifts, but there was no real rest. Even off duty, people sat in the mess hall staring at their food, or lay in their bunks staring at the ceiling, knowing they were deep in enemy territory with no backup and no way out except forward. Daniel made his rounds through the ship. It was something he did every day, a habit from his first command. He walked through engineering, where Patrick and his team worked in near silence, monitoring systems and making repairs to damage that had not happened yet but would, inevitably, when things went wrong. He visited the medical bay, where Dr. Karen White checked her supplies and prepared for casualties she hoped would never come. She was 36, calm and competent, with steady hands and a gift for keeping people alive even when the odds said they should die. He stopped in the mess hall where off-duty crew members sat quietly. Chief Sophie Clark was there, a grizzled weapons specialist who had served on 7 ships in her 20-year career. She was drinking coffee that was probably terrible and reading something on her tablet. She looked up when Daniel entered and nodded. He nodded back. No words were necessary. They both knew what they had signed up for. When Daniel returned to the bridge, Lisa met him with a tablet containing a situation report. The Krell presence in the 3rd sector was significantly higher than intelligence had predicted. They were running more patrols, with overlapping sensor coverage that left very few gaps. Kate estimated their chances of getting through undetected had dropped to approximately 40%. Daniel read the report twice. 40%. Those were terrible odds, but they were the odds they had. He asked Lisa what she recommended. She hesitated. Lisa rarely hesitated. Then she said they could try to find an alternative route, loop around through the 4th sector. It would add 2 weeks to their journey, but the Krell presence there was lighter. Daniel considered this. 2 weeks. The people on New Horizon did not have 2 weeks. The plague was accelerating. Every day they delayed, more people died. He told Lisa they were maintaining course. They would thread the needle or they would fail trying, but they would not waste time they did not have. Lisa accepted this without argument. She had expected the answer. She returned to her station and began coordinating with Kate on the most viable route through the sensor net ahead. They made another jump, and another, each one successful, each one leaving them deeper in Krell space, further from any hope of rescue or retreat. The tension on the bridge became a living thing, a weight that pressed down on everyone. Jake's hands stopped shaking only because he forced them to. Kate's calculations became even more precise, as if perfection was the only defense against the crushing pressure of what they were attempting. Then, 48 hours into their penetration, the sensors detected something that made Lisa call Daniel to tactical immediately. It was a distress signal, human frequency, automated beacon. Lisa traced it to a civilian transport vessel, the Meridian, registered out of the colony of Far Hope. The ship was adrift, engines dead, and there were Krell energy signatures all around it. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He asked Lisa for details. She brought up the tactical plot. The Meridian was surrounded by 3 Krell destroyers. Sensor readings indicated the civilian ship still had life support, which meant there were people alive on board. The Krell were not firing. They were preparing to board. Daniel asked how many people. Lisa checked the Meridian's registry. Standard colony transport. Capacity of 300 passengers. Given that it was running, probably full or close to it. 300 people, civilians, families, children probably, and the Krell were about to board them. Everyone on the bridge knew what that meant. The Krell did not take prisoners often, and when they did, those prisoners disappeared into labor camps where life expectancy was measured in months. Kate spoke quietly. She noted that the Meridian was 3 million kilometers off their course. They could avoid the area entirely. The Krell seemed focused on the transport and were not running wide sensor sweeps. Daniel stared at the tactical display. 3 Krell destroyers. The Defiant might be able to handle one in a fight maybe. 3 would destroy them in minutes. And even if they won, the noise of battle would bring every Krell ship in the sector down on their heads. The mission would fail. The data core would never reach the Council. 20,000 people would die on New Horizon. Lisa stood beside him. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. She said what they were both thinking. 300 lives versus 20,000. The mathematics were clear. They had to let the Meridian go. Daniel knew she was right. Every tactical bone in his body knew she was right. This was exactly the kind of impossible choice that command training prepared you for. You could not save everyone. Sometimes you had to sacrifice the few for the many. But Daniel also knew that if he gave the order to bypass the Meridian, if he let 300 people go to their deaths without even trying, then something in him would break. Something that made him human. And he wondered what the point of saving humanity was if you stopped being human in the process. He turned to Lisa. He told her to call the senior staff to the briefing room. All of them. Kate, Patrick over the comm, Sophie from weapons. He wanted Dr. White there too. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. She knew what this meant. She started to protest, to remind him of the mission, but Daniel cut her off gently. He said he knew what the mission was. He also knew he needed his senior staff's input before making this decision. That was all he would say. 10 minutes later, they were assembled in the briefing room. It was a small space with a table that could seat 8. The walls displayed tactical data and star charts. Daniel stood at the head of the table and laid out the situation simply. 300 civilians, 3 Krell destroyers, a mission that could not afford delays or complications. He asked for opinions. Lisa spoke first. She was clear and direct. The mission came first. It had to. They were carrying proof that could save 20,000 lives and potentially prevent the Krell from deploying bioweapons against other colonies. If they compromised that mission for 300 people, no matter how much it hurt, they would be failing tens of thousands. Dr. White spoke next. Her voice was soft but firm. She pointed out that they were doctors, soldiers, people who had sworn to protect. The Meridian's passengers were not numbers on a tactical display. They were real people in immediate danger. She asked how they could call themselves protectors if they sailed past people who needed help. Sophie, the old weapons chief, looked at the tactical display. She noted that 3 destroyers were tough odds but not impossible. If they caught the Krell by surprise, if they were smart about it, they might pull it off. She added that she did not join the Navy to let civilians die when she had guns that could help. Kate ran numbers on her tablet. She calculated that a rescue attempt would take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how the battle went. That would delay them significantly and increase the chances of Krell reinforcements arriving. The risk to the mission was substantial. Then Patrick spoke. His voice was rough, thick with emotion. He said he had watched his family die because no one came to help. He had lived with that for 5 years. Every day he woke up knowing that somewhere someone could have saved them but did not. He looked directly at Daniel and said he would not become that someone, not ever. The room fell silent. Daniel looked at each of them. Lisa, who was right about the tactics. Karen, who was right about their duty. Sophie, who was ready to fight. Kate, who knew the numbers. Patrick, who carried the weight of loss. Daniel made his decision. He told them they were going in. They would attempt to rescue the Meridian's passengers. If they failed, if the mission was compromised, that would be on him. But he could not and would not order this ship to pass by people in need. That was not what Earth sent them out here to do. Lisa started to argue, but then she stopped. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She asked what the plan was. Daniel turned to the tactical display. They had one advantage. The Krell did not know the Defiant was here. That meant surprise. They needed to use it perfectly. Patrick had an idea. It was crazy, dangerous, and violated about 17 safety protocols. He proposed they vent plasma from the reactor in a controlled burst. It would create a sensor bloom that would blind Krell detection for about 30 seconds. In that window, they could close the distance and hit the Krell ships before they knew what was happening. Sophie added they should target the Krell command ship first. Take out the leader and the other 2 would hesitate, just for a few seconds. Krell doctrine was rigid. They followed the chain of command religiously. Disrupting that chain created chaos. Kate plotted an approach vector that would bring them in from the Krell's blind spot, using the Meridian itself as cover. It would require precision flying and perfect timing, but it was possible. Daniel synthesized their ideas into a plan. They would jump in close, vent the plasma bloom, and target the command ship with everything they had. While the Krell were reacting, Patrick would lead a boarding team to the Meridian, get the civilians off, and bring them back to the Defiant. They would have maybe 10 minutes before Krell reinforcements arrived. Then they would run. It was a terrible plan with a dozen ways to fail. But it was the only plan they had. They returned to their stations. Daniel sat in the captain's chair and gave the orders. Kate plotted the jump. Patrick went engineering to prepare the plasma vent and suit up for the boarding action. Sophie powered up every weapon system the Defiant had. Jake sat at his console, no longer shaking. His fear had transformed into focus. Lisa stood beside Daniel. She told him quietly that this was probably going to get them all killed. Daniel agreed. She said she was glad he made this choice anyway. He looked at her, surprised. She explained that she had been right about the tactics, but he was right about something more important. They were human. Humans helped each other. If they forgot that, the Krell had already won. Kate announced they were ready. Jump calculated and locked in. Daniel gave the order. The Defiant jumped. They emerged from hyperspace 200 kilometers from the Meridian. The Krell destroyers were exactly where sensors had predicted, moving into boarding positions. For 3 seconds, nobody on either side moved. The Krell had not expected a human warship to appear in the middle of their operation. Patrick triggered the plasma vent. Superheated gas erupted from the Defiant's reactor in a controlled explosion that lit up every sensor for light seconds in every direction. It was like setting off a flare in a dark room. Everyone was blind. Except the Defiant was already moving. Kate had calculated their approach down to the meter, and she flew the ship on manual control, trusting her instruments and her instincts. Sophie had identified the Krell command ship and locked missiles before the plasma bloom. She fired the instant the vent triggered. 12 missiles streaked across the gap at maximum acceleration. The Krell command ship was still processing the sensor anomaly when the first missile hit its shields. The second and third missiles struck before the shields could compensate. The fourth missile penetrated and detonated against the hull. Jake opened fire with the particle beams, walking them across the command ship's weakened shields. He was no longer thinking about being afraid. He was thinking about 300 people who needed help. His targeting was precise, methodical. He did not miss. The Krell command ship tried to return fire, but its systems were overloading. The captain on that bridge was screaming orders, trying to understand how a human ship had appeared from nowhere. That confusion cost him his life. The Defiant's next missile salvo hit the command ship's reactor. The Krell destroyer exploded in a ball of purple fire. The other 2 Krell destroyers hesitated. Just as Sophie had predicted, they fell back on doctrine. Without their command ship, they began defensive maneuvers while trying to establish a new command structure. That hesitation gave the Defiant seconds that were worth their weight in gold. Kate brought the Defiant alongside the Meridian. The civilian transport was massive compared to the destroyer, a blocky cargo hauler with passenger compartments. Its hull was scarred and its engines were cold. Daniel could see boarding tubes already attached to its airlocks. Krell soldiers were inside. Patrick and his team were already in the airlock. 6 people in combat armor carrying weapons designed for boarding actions. Patrick checked his team's seals one more time, then gave Daniel the signal. They were ready. The Defiant extended its own boarding tube and locked onto the Meridian's emergency airlock. Patrick's team went across fast, weapons up, expecting contact. They found it immediately. 3 Krell soldiers were herding civilians toward a holding area. Patrick's team opened fire. The fight inside the Meridian was brutal and close. The Krell were bigger, stronger, and their armor was better. But Patrick's team knew the ship's layout from the registry files. They used the corridors, the hatches, the confined spaces where Krell size became a disadvantage. Patrick himself took down a Krell soldier by venting atmosphere in a maintenance corridor, then using the explosive decompression to slam the enemy into a bulkhead. Outside, the 2 remaining Krell destroyers had reorganized. They opened fire on the Defiant. Lisa called for evasive maneuvers, but they were locked in position by the boarding tube. Kate could not move the ship without killing Patrick's team. Sophie targeted the closer destroyer and fired everything they had. The Krell returned fire. Missiles and particle beams crossed the gap. The Defiant's shields flared under the impacts. Damage reports started flowing to Lisa's console. Hull breaches on decks 3 and 5. Shield generator 2 offline. Casualties in engineering section. Daniel gripped the arms of his chair and watched the tactical display. He could not help Patrick. He could not move the ship. All he could do was trust his people to do the impossible. Inside the Meridian, Patrick reached the civilian holding area. 287 people were crammed into a cargo bay, terrified and crying. Children screamed. Adults tried to shield them with their bodies. Patrick's armor was scorched, his weapon nearly empty, but he managed to smile behind his helmet visor. He told them they were Earth Navy and they were here to help. He needed everyone to move quickly and stay calm. They were going to get out of here. The civilians started moving. Patrick's team formed a perimeter, fighting off Krell's soldiers who were trying to retake the bay. One of Patrick's people went down with a plasma burn to the leg. Another took a hit that cracked her armor but kept fighting. They got the civilians into the corridor, moving them toward the boarding tube. A child fell and Patrick picked her up, carrying her while firing his weapon one-handed. An old man could not move fast enough and Patrick's teammate carried him. They moved as one group, soldiers and civilians fighting for every meter. On the Defiant, Jake watched his weapon's charge tick down. They were running out of missiles. The Krell were not. He targeted, fired. His hands were steady. He was doing his job. Lisa reported that long-range sensors showed more Krell ships inbound. They had maybe 5 minutes before this became a situation they could not escape. Daniel opened a channel to Patrick. He needed a status update. Patrick's voice came back between weapon fire and explosions. They had the civilians moving to extraction. 2 minutes. 2 minutes they did not have, but Daniel told him to take the time they needed. They would hold. The Defiant took another hit. The ship shook hard enough that Daniel had to grab his chair to stay seated. Alarms blared. Dr. White called from medical bay. She had casualties and needed help. Daniel sent everyone who could be spared. Then Patrick's team reached the boarding tube. Civilians poured through, terrified but alive. Patrick's team came last, carrying their wounded. One soldier stayed behind to seal the tube, then ran across as the connection detached. Kate did not wait for the order. The instant the tube was clear, she fired the maneuvering thrusters and threw the Defiant into a hard turn that pulled 3 Gs. People slammed into their restraints. Civilians in the corridors crashed into walls. But they were moving, breaking away from the Meridian. Sophie fired their last missiles at the Krell destroyers, not trying to hit but to force them to evade. It worked. The Krell ships broke formation. Kate plotted a jump vector that should not work, a micro-jump that would take them past the incoming Krell reinforcements. Daniel gave the order. They jumped. For 3 seconds, space bent around them. Then they were back in normal space, 10 light seconds from the battle, with 5 Krell ships behind them and clear space ahead. Kate did not stop. She kept the Defiant at maximum burn, putting distance between them and pursuit. Daniel slumped in his chair. They had done it. Somehow, impossibly, they had done it. 287 civilians were alive. The data core was intact. The Defiant was damaged but functional. Lisa pulled up a damage report. It was extensive. They had lost shield generator 2, had hull breaches on 3 decks, and their missile stores were depleted. Casualties were being tallied, but preliminary reports showed 15 wounded and 3 dead. Daniel felt the weight of those 3 deaths settle on his shoulders. 3 people who would have been alive if he had chosen to bypass the Meridian. 3 people who died because he made a choice. But then he thought about the 287 civilians crowding into the Defiant's corridors. Children who would grow up, families who would stay together, people who had faced death and been given another chance. Patrick came to the bridge. His armor was scorched and dented. He had a plasma burn on his left arm that medical had wrapped hastily. He reported that all civilians were aboard and being processed. They had lost 13 people before the team could reach them. The Krell had killed them when the Defiant opened fire. Daniel nodded. 13 lives they could not save, 3 crew members dead. But 287 people alive who should have died. The mathematics of command were brutal and simple. He ordered the ship to secure from combat stations. Medical teams should attend to the wounded. Engineering teams should make repairs. They were not out of danger yet. They were still deep in Krell space with a damaged ship, depleted weapons, and 287 extra people aboard. But they were alive, and they were moving forward. Kate plotted their course through the next sector. It would be harder now. The Krell knew they were here. Every ship in 3 sectors would be hunting them. The element of surprise was gone. Lisa stood beside Daniel's chair. She told him the Krell fleet was mobilizing. They had maybe 24 hours before the pursuit became overwhelming. They needed to move fast and smart. Daniel looked at his crew, Jake sitting at weapons, finally starting to realize what he had just done. Sophie checking her systems, already preparing for the next fight. Kate at navigation, her mind racing through calculations that would keep them alive. Lisa beside him, steady and competent even when she disagreed with his choices. And he thought about Patrick, who had led the boarding team because he remembered what it felt like to lose everyone and refused to let that happen to someone else. About Dr. White, working in a damaged medical bay to save lives. About Chief Clark, who had been ready to fight even when the odds were impossible. About every member of his crew who had risen to this challenge. They were not the strongest, they were not the best equipped, but they were human, and that meant something. It meant they helped each other. It meant they fought for what was right even when it was costly. It meant they made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Daniel gave the order to proceed. They would continue the mission. They would get the data core to the council. They would save New Horizon. And they would do it with 287 civilians aboard because that was what humans did. The Defiant moved through the darkness of space, damaged but determined. Behind them, the Krell Empire mobilized its fleets. Ahead of them lay sectors of enemy territory and odds that made survival unlikely. But Captain Daniel Cross sat in his chair, surrounded by his crew, and felt something he had not expected to feel. Hope. Not the easy hope of certain victory, but the harder hope that came from knowing they had made the right choice. That they had done the impossible once and might do it again. That one human warship had crossed enemy lines, and if the Empire was not trembling yet, it would be soon. The throne room of the Krell Empire stretched 300 meters from entrance to dais, designed to make visitors feel small. Emperor Thrask sat on a seat carved from a single piece of black stone, watching holographic displays that floated in the air before him. Each display showed a different sector of his empire, ships moving in perfect formation, planets held under absolute control. 3 centuries of power, 3 centuries of dominance, 3 centuries without challenge. Until 12 hours ago. Thrask was 240 years old, his species aging far slower than humans. His skin was deep purple, almost black, and his eyes were solid gold without pupils. He wore armor even in his throne room, a habit from his days as a military commander before he took the crown. The armor was ceremonial now, inlaid with precious metals and gems that represented worlds he had conquered. But it was still functional. An emperor who could not fight was not an emperor worth following. His military advisor, General Crane, stood before the throne. Crane was younger, only 90 years old, but he had risen through the ranks quickly through sheer competence and ruthlessness. He was explaining the situation, and with each word, Thrask's anger grew colder. A single human destroyer had penetrated 3 defensive layers. It had evaded detection for 36 hours while moving through sectors that were supposed to be impenetrable. Then it had appeared from nowhere, destroyed a Krell destroyer, rescued enemy civilians from 2 other ships, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. 6 Krell vessels damaged or destroyed. 0 human casualties in the escape. Thrask listened to all of this in silence. When Crane finished, the Emperor asked a single question. How was this possible? Crane hesitated. That hesitation told Thrask everything. His military did not know. They had no explanation for how a single human ship had done what should be impossible. The general tried to suggest it was luck, an anomaly, a one-time occurrence that would not repeat. Thrask dismissed this immediately. Luck did not account for the tactical decisions the human captain had made. The plasma vent to blind sensors. The the precise targeting of the command ship, the micro jump into a gravity well. These were not lucky accidents. These were creative solutions to problems that Krell doctrine said had no solution. That was what disturbed Thrask most. Not that the humans had better technology, because they did not. Not that they had superior numbers, because a single ship meant nothing against the Empire's fleets. What disturbed him was that they had done something the Krell could not predict. They had broken the rules of engagement and won because of it. Thrask stood from his throne. He told Crane that the human ship must not reach neutral space. Whatever intelligence it carried, whatever mission it pursued, it ended here. He would take personal command of the pursuit. His flagship, the Dominion, would hunt this human vessel and destroy it. Not because one ship threatened the Empire, but because letting it escape would send a message Thrask could not allow, that the Krell could be defied. Crane tried to argue that an emperor should not risk himself for one enemy ship. Thrask cut him off with a gesture. He said this was not about one ship. This was about what that ship represented: human unpredictability, human refusal to accept inevitable defeat. If the Empire could not crush that spirit now, completely and publicly, it would spread. Other species would wonder if they too could defy the Krell. The foundation of imperial power was certainty. That certainty had just been challenged. 6 hours later, the Dominion launched from the Imperial shipyards. It was the largest warship in the Krell fleet, a dreadnought 3 kilometers long with weapons that could level continents. Its shields could withstand sustained bombardment from an entire battle group. Its crew numbered 5,000, all veterans, all completely loyal to their emperor. It had never been defeated. It had never even been seriously damaged. Thrask stood on the bridge and ordered maximum speed. Every sensor in 3 sectors was focused on finding the human ship. Every Krell vessel was feeding data to the Dominion's tactical computers. The humans could not hide forever. They would be found, and they would be eliminated. Aboard the Defiant, Daniel was learning what command felt like when everything went wrong at once. The ship was damaged. They were carrying nearly 300 civilians with no place to put them. Krell ships were actively hunting them instead of just patrolling. And Kate's calculations showed that the route they had planned was no longer viable. The Krell had closed too many gaps, increased patrols in too many sectors. The safe corridors they had relied on were gone. He stood in the briefing room with his senior staff, looking at a tactical map that showed nothing but bad options. Lisa pointed out the obvious problem. With the civilians aboard, they were slower and had less room to maneuver. The extra mass meant longer jump calculations and higher power consumption. They were burning through fuel reserves at a rate that would leave them stranded before they reached neutral space. Patrick reported from engineering that repairs were proceeding, but they needed parts he did not have. Shield Generator 2 was completely offline and would stay that way unless they could dock at a facility with proper equipment. They were operating at 70% combat effectiveness, and that number was dropping as more systems showed stress fractures from the battle. Dr. White had better news. The wounded were stable, and she had treated the civilians for various minor injuries and shock, but she was running low on medical supplies. If they had another engagement like the last one, she would not have enough trauma supplies to handle mass casualties. The picture was clear. The Defiant was wounded, overloaded, and being hunted by forces that grew stronger every hour. Daniel asked Kate for options. Any options? Kate had been working on this problem for 6 hours straight. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from staring at navigation plots. She brought up a route that made Lisa suck in a sharp breath. Kate proposed they go through the Veil. The Veil was a stellar nursery, a region where new stars were being born. It was a nightmare of radiation, gravitational anomalies, and sensor interference. Ships avoided it because navigating through it was essentially impossible. The radiation would cook any crew that lingered too long. The gravity wells shifted unpredictably. The sensor interference meant flying blind. Lisa immediately said no. They would die in the Veil. The radiation alone would kill them in hours. Kate countered that they would die anyway if the Krell caught them. At least the Veil gave them a chance. The Krell would not follow them in. Their ships were too large, too inflexible. The Defiant was small enough to navigate the gaps between gravity wells if Kate could plot the course precisely enough. Patrick said he could boost the radiation shielding, maybe give them enough protection to survive transit. It would drain their power reserves even faster, but if it kept the crew alive long enough to get through, it would be worth it. Daniel considered this. The veil was suicide, but staying in open space while the Krell net tightened around them was also suicide, just slower. At least the veil offered the possibility of escape. He asked Kate how confident she was that she could navigate it. Kate met his eyes. She said she had a theoretical model that should work. Theoretical, should. Those were not comforting words, but they were the only words she had. Daniel made the decision. They would attempt the veil. Kate should plot the course. Patrick should maximize radiation shielding. Lisa should prepare the crew for rough navigation. But first there was another problem to address. The civilians. Daniel had asked one of them, a woman named Helen Bradford, to join them. Helen had been a transport captain before the Krell killed her crew and seized her ship. She was 52 years old, gray-haired and tough as steel. She had organized the other civilians, kept them calm, helped distribute them through the ship in ways that minimized disruption to operations. Daniel explained the situation to her directly. They were attempting a dangerous route. The radiation might kill them all. The gravity could tear the ship apart. If she and the other civilians wanted to take their chances with lifeboats, with the hope that another ship might find them before their air ran out, he would understand. Helen listened to all of this. Then she said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. She said the civilians knew what the Defiant was carrying. They had pieced it together from conversations overheard, from the intensity of the crew's focus, from the fact that a military ship was risking everything to cross Krell space. They knew about New Horizon. They knew about the bioweapon evidence. Helen told him that the 287 civilians had talked among themselves. They had voted. Every single one of them wanted to stay on the Defiant. If the mission failed because they added weight or used resources, then 20,000 people would die. The civilians understood mathematics. 287 lives versus 20,000. The equation was clear. She asked Daniel to let them take the lifeboats, to give the mission its best chance. They were asking for the opportunity to matter, to make their survival mean something beyond just being saved. Daniel felt something break inside him. These people had already faced death once. They had been prisoners of the Krell, moments from being shipped to labor camps or worse. His crew had risked everything to save them, and now they were volunteering to die in space if it meant the mission succeeded. He started to refuse. Started to tell Helen that he would not ask that sacrifice. But before he could speak, Lisa interrupted. She told Daniel he should hear from the crew first. Lisa opened a ship-wide channel. She explained the situation to every crew member. The civilians wanted to take lifeboats to give the Defiant better odds of completing the mission. It was their choice to make. But Lisa wanted the crew to understand what that meant before any decision was finalized. The responses came immediately. Jake, the young weapons officer who had frozen in his first combat, said he did not rescue those people just to throw them away. If the Defiant could not complete the mission with civilians aboard, then the mission was not worth completing. Sophie, the veteran weapons chief, said she had seen enough people die. She would not volunteer anyone for death, and she would not let them volunteer themselves. Not while she had breath. Patrick's voice came from engineering, rough with emotion. He said he had lost his family because no one would help them. He had spent 5 years living with that wound. These civilians wanted to sacrifice themselves, wanted to be heroes, and he understood that, but he would not let them. The Defiant had saved them. That meant the Defiant protected them, period. Dr. White added that her oath was to preserve life, not calculate which lives were worth more than others. Every person on the ship mattered, the civilians, the crew, the people on New Horizon. They would find a way to save all of them or die trying. Kate, still working on navigation calculations, said simply that she had plotted the course assuming full mass. The civilians were already factored into her numbers. Changing that now would just waste time. One by one, every department on the ship responded. Every single voice said the same thing. The civilians stayed. They would run together or fall together. That was what it meant to be human. Daniel looked at Helen. He told her he appreciated what she and the others were willing to do, but his crew had spoken. The civilians were not cargo to be jettisoned. They were people the Defiant had fought to save. That fight was not over. Helen's eyes filled with tears. She thanked him. Then she went to tell the other civilians. An hour later, Daniel received reports that civilians were helping in engineering, assisting in medical, working in the mess hall to feed the crew. They had been saved, and now they were contributing however they could. The Defiant moved toward the Veil. Behind them, Krell's sensors tracked their course. On the Dominion, Emperor Thrask watched the tactical display and smiled. The humans were trapped. Ahead of them was the Veil, which would kill them. Behind them was the Imperial fleet. The only question was whether Thrask would have the satisfaction of destroying them personally, or if the Veil would do it for him. Then the Defiant did something Thrask did not expect. It did not try to slip past the Krell net. It did not attempt another micro-jump. Instead, it turned and accelerated directly toward the Dominion. On the Defiant's bridge, Daniel stood at the center viewport and watched the massive Krell flagship grow larger on the screens. Lisa had questioned this decision, naturally. Attacking the Dominion was insane. They would be destroyed in seconds. Daniel explained his reasoning. The Krell expected them to run. Every tactical algorithm in the Imperial fleet was calculating escape vectors and pursuit courses. By doing the opposite, by attacking, they would create a few seconds of confusion. Not much, but maybe enough. Patrick had been working on something. A weapon that was not really a weapon. He had taken the safety systems from the reactor, combined them with the few missiles they had left, and created a device that would generate an electromagnetic pulse. Not a big one. Not enough to damage the Dominion's heavy shielding, but enough to blind every sensor in the sector for about 4 seconds. The cost was everything. The pulse would burn out the Defiant sensors too. They would be flying blind through Krell space with no way to detect ships, obstacles, or navigation hazards. Kate would have to navigate using stellar cartography alone, plotting their position from visual observation of stars and manual calculations. It was the worst plan Daniel had ever authorized. It was also the only plan they had. The Defiant closed to within weapons range of the Dominion. Thrask watched this approach with growing bewilderment. The human captain was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. The Dominion's weapons locked on. Thrask prepared to give the order to fire. Then Patrick triggered the pulse. The electromagnetic cascade erupted from the Defiant like a supernova compressed into 4 seconds. Every sensor screen within 10 light seconds went white. Every computer started emergency reboots. Every ship in the Krell fleet was suddenly blind, deaf, and unable to communicate. On the Dominion, Thrask experienced something he had not felt in 100 years: helplessness. His bridge went dark. Emergency systems kicked in immediately, but those vital 4 seconds were already gone. When his sensors came back online, the human ship had vanished. On the Defiant, the bridge was lit only by emergency lighting. Every screen was dead. Kate stood at the navigation station with a paper star chart spread before her and a mechanical sextant in her hands. It was a navigation tool from Earth's sailing age, updated for space. She looked through the viewport at the stars and made measurements the way navigators had done 500 years ago. Daniel watched her work. The entire ship's survival depended on Kate's ability to identify stars, measure angles, and calculate their position using mathematics that most people learned in history classes. One mistake, one miscalculation, and they would drift into a Krell ship or jump into a star or simply be lost forever in the darkness. Kate called out coordinates. Her voice was steady, professional, hiding the terror that Daniel knew she must be feeling. Lisa relayed the coordinates to Helm Control, which was operating on manual inputs. They were flying a starship like an ancient aircraft, trusting instruments and instinct instead of computers. The Defiant moved through darkness. They passed within 200 meters of a Krell destroyer, close enough that people could see the enemy ships running lights through the viewports, close enough to read the hull markings. The Krell were as blind as the Defiant. Neither ship knew the other was there until they had passed. Jake sat at his dead weapons console and gripped the edges hard enough that his hands ached. He could not fight, could not defend, could only trust that Kate knew where she was going. Beside him, Sophie sat in similar silence, a veteran warrior reduced to a passenger. In medical, Dr. White had prepared for casualties but found herself with nothing to do except wait. She had patients who needed rest, supplies that needed organizing, and too much time to think about all the ways this could go wrong. She prayed quietly, something she had not done since she was a child. Patrick stood in engineering, monitoring the reactor by sight and sound and feel. He could not see the readouts, could not check the computer models. He watched pressure gauges and listened to the hum of the core and relied on 20 years of experience to keep them running. When a coupling started to overheat, he sensed it from the change in vibration and fixed it before it failed. Kate made another measurement, calculated another position, called out new coordinates. They were flying through a three-dimensional minefield of Krell ships, all of them equally blind, all of them potentially deadly. Every second that passed was a second they survived against impossible odds. Then Kate said three words that made Daniel's heart race. Jump point identified. She had found their escape vector using nothing but star positions and mathematics. She gave Lisa the coordinates. The jump needed to be precise. If they were off by even a small margin, they would emerge inside a star or in deep space with no way to navigate back. Daniel did not hesitate. He trusted Kate absolutely. He ordered the jump. The Defiant's jump drive, operating on manual override and backup power, spooled up. The ship vibrated as exotic physics bent space around them. They jumped 1 second before the Krell sensors finished their reboot cycles. The Defiant emerged in neutral space. Kate had threaded them through Krell territory, through sensor nets and patrol patterns, through blind navigation and impossible odds. They had made it. For a moment, nobody spoke. The bridge was still dark, sensors still offline. But through the viewport, they could see stars that were not Krell territory. Stars that marked neutral space where the Empire's authority ended. Then someone started clapping. It might have been Jake. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire bridge crew was applauding, laughing, crying with relief. They had done the impossible. They had crossed an empire, fought its ships, saved civilians, and escaped with the mission intact. Daniel sat down heavily in his chair. His legs would not hold him anymore. Lisa stood beside him, and for the first time since he had known her, she was smiling. A real smile, not the professional expression she usually wore. She told him that was the craziest thing she had ever been part of. He agreed completely. Patrick's voice came over the ship-wide comm. He wanted to report that they were a mess. Half their systems were fried, the reactor needed a complete overhaul, and they were running on fumes and prayers. But they were alive and in neutral space. He called that a win. Kate slumped in her chair, the sextant still in her hands. She had navigated a starship using 500-year-old techniques through the most defended space in the galaxy. Daniel told her over the comm that her performance was beyond exceptional. She just nodded, too exhausted for words. But they were not done yet. Lisa reminded everyone that they still needed to transmit the data core to the Galactic Council. That was the entire point of this mission. She began setting up the communication systems, working with limited power to establish a connection to Council space. While she worked, Daniel received an incoming transmission. It took a moment to realize it was from Krell space. From the Dominion, Emperor Thrask himself was calling. Daniel hesitated, then accepted the transmission. Thrask's face appeared on the screen. The Emperor looked composed, regal, completely in control. But Daniel could see something in those golden eyes. Anger, yes, but also something else. Uncertainty. Thrask spoke in perfect standard. He said he had underestimated humans. He had assumed they were like other species, predictable and ultimately controllable. But the Defiant had demonstrated something dangerous. Creativity, unpredictability, the willingness to attempt the impossible. The Emperor told Daniel that this was not over. The Krell would find Earth. They would find every human colony. What the Defiant had done, crossing imperial space and defying Krell power, was an act of war whether Earth acknowledged it or not. The Empire would respond. Daniel listened to this. Then he responded. He thanked Thrask for the warning, but he wanted the Emperor to understand something. The Defiant was one ship, one crew. They were not special forces or elite soldiers. They were ordinary people who had done extraordinary things because they had to. because that was what humans did when pushed to the edge. He told Thrask that the Emperor was right to be concerned, not because humans had better technology. They did not. Not because humans were stronger or faster or smarter. They were not, but because humans had something the Krell had spent 3 centuries forgetting: the ability to adapt, the willingness to try solutions that should not work, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat was certain. Daniel said that one human warship had crossed Krell space, had fought Krell ships, had saved civilians despite impossible odds, had escaped an entire Imperial fleet. If one ship could do that, what would happen when Earth sent 100 ships? 1,000? What would happen when every human colony learned that the Krell could be defied? Thrask's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. Daniel saw it: fear, not of the Defiant, not even of Earth's potential military might. Fear of what the Defiant represented. That certainty could be shattered, that rules could be broken, that empires built on assumed superiority could fall when that assumption proved false. The transmission ended. Thrask did not say goodbye. The screen went dark. Daniel sat in his chair and tried to process what had just happened. He had threatened an emperor, an empire, with one damaged destroyer and a crew held together by determination and luck. Lisa reported that the Council connection was established. The data core was ready to transmit. Daniel gave the authorization. The evidence of Krell bioweapon testing, the proof that would save New Horizon and potentially prevent future atrocities, uploaded to Council servers. The mission was complete. The crew erupted in celebration again. This time Daniel joined them. He stood and shook hands, accepted hugs, laughed with genuine joy. They had done it. Against every odd, every probability, every reasonable expectation, they had succeeded. Helen Bradford came to the bridge with several other civilians. She thanked Daniel personally, thanked the crew. She said they had saved not just lives but hope. They had shown that ordinary people could stand against tyranny and win. That sacrifices made with courage and conviction could change worlds. Daniel felt the weight of command shift. It was still heavy. 3 crew members had died. The ship was barely functional. They had made enemies of an empire that could, if it chose, destroy Earth. But they had also saved 287 civilians. They had delivered evidence that would save 20,000 more. They had proven that humans could defy the Krell and survive. In the days that followed, the Defiant limped to the nearest neutral station for repairs. The Council acknowledged receipt of the data core and confirmed it was being reviewed. Diplomatic channels began discussing the implications. The civilians were processed and given transport to safe colonies. The crew received commendations, though Daniel suspected few of them cared about medals after what they had experienced. Patrick spent weeks rebuilding the reactor and replacing burned-out systems. Kate reviewed her navigation logs and realized she had made 3 calculation errors during the blind flight. Any one of them should have been fatal. She had compensated instinctively, without even realizing it. Jake requested permanent assignment to the Defiant. He had found his courage in combat and did not want to lose it. Sophie submitted her retirement papers, then withdrew them a week later. She said she had survived 40 years in the Navy. She would survive a few more if it meant working with a crew like this. Dr. White expanded medical to handle civilian evacuations, suspecting they would see more refugee situations in the future. Lisa was promoted and offered her own command. She turned it down. She told Daniel that she had found a captain worth serving under, one who made impossible decisions and somehow made them work. She was staying on the Defiant. Daniel stood on the observation deck 6 weeks after they had crossed into neutral space. The Defiant was still in dock, still being repaired, still bearing the scars of her journey. He looked at the ship and thought about everything that had happened. They had started with a mission to deliver data. They had ended with something more. They had shown that humans could be unpredictable, creative, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat. They had rescued people when tactics said to abandon them. They had fought when strategy said to run. They had navigated by stars when technology failed. And somewhere in Krell space, an emperor sat on his throne and wondered what he had unleashed. Thrask had hunted one human ship to prove Krell superiority. Instead, He had proven that humans would fight, would sacrifice, would dare the impossible rather than submit. That knowledge would spread through the empire. It would reach other conquered species. They would wonder if they too could defy their masters. The Defiant was one ship, but one ship had been enough to plant doubt in an empire built on certainty. One crew had been enough to inspire hope in people who had forgotten what hope felt like. One impossible journey had been enough to change the calculation of power in the galaxy. Daniel received new orders eventually. The Defiant was to return to Earth for formal repairs and refit. The crew would receive official recognition. The mission would be studied, analyzed, turned into doctrine. Daniel suspected it would all miss the point. The point was not the tactics they used or the technology they employed. The point was that they cared. They cared enough about civilians to risk the mission. They cared enough about each other to refuse the easy answer. They cared enough about humanity to show the galaxy what humans could be at their best. Before the Defiant left the neutral station, Daniel received a message. It was from New Horizon. The evidence they had delivered had been verified and presented to the Galactic Council. The Council had authorized immediate medical intervention. Ships were already en route with treatments and supplies. The plague was being contained. Lives were being saved. 20,000 people would live because the Defiant had crossed Krell space. 287 civilians would live because the crew had chosen to fight. And somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy, other species were learning that the Krell Empire could be challenged. Daniel sat in the captain's chair when the Defiant finally departed the station. His crew was at their posts. The ship was still scarred but flight-ready. Ahead lay the journey home, recognition, perhaps even consequences for the diplomatic situation they had created. But Daniel was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about how one ship could matter. How ordinary people could do extraordinary things. How humanity's greatest strength was not technology or tactics, but the simple refusal to give up on each other. The Defiant moved away from the station, engines burning clean and bright. Behind them, neutral space. Ahead, the long journey home. And throughout the galaxy, the story spreading. One human warship crossed enemy lines. One crew defied an empire. And that empire trembled, not because humans were invincible. Not because their victory was assured, but because they had proven that certainty could be shattered, that rules could be broken, and that empires built on fear could crack when faced with courage. Emperor Thrask would remember the Defiant, would remember Captain Daniel Cross and his impossible crew, would remember that one ship had done what should not be possible, and in his throne room, surrounded by displays showing his vast empire, Thrask would wonder what happened next. When Earth sent not one ship but many, when humans stopped reacting and started acting, when the species that refused to accept defeat decided to fight. The Krell Empire had ruled for 3 centuries, but empires fall, not always to greater power, sometimes to simple, stubborn human determination, and one human warship had just shown the galaxy what that determination looked like.